Perfect. Okay. And then Alicia, keep us grounded. That's all I got.
Okay.
Keep us on the planet.
I feel like
I like how when the zoom is focused on Alicia and the screen becomes purple, there's a bit of a purple glow behind me as well.
Oh, that does. Whoa. I didn't notice that.
oh my gosh. I can get you your own light set up, your own LED light set up, Vitalik.
Hey guys.
Hi, everybody.
Good morning. Hello, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
GM.
Good morning.
Oh.
Morning.
GM. Good to see everybody. Welcome to the call. GM. Okay, wonderful, everybody. Thank you for joining. If you can mute yourself after your good mornings, would be much appreciated. We will mute everyone soon if you haven't muted yourself. But we're really excited to kick off in just a minute here. We have about an hour and 15 minutes with Vitalik. So we're really excited about that. If you have any background noise. If Sachin can help me on something muted.
Can you guys, like, just these speakers, can you guys now unmute yourself? Okay.
I can. Let's see.
Yes. Hello.
Hello.
Madam.
All right.
Hello, everybody. How's everyone's day going today?
Doing well. Okay, we're gonna kick off.
I'm doing well too.
Vitalik, I feel like you're always doing well, man. I feel it's hard to not do well when you're building one of the most incredible technologies for humankind.
Well, we'll talk about that a little bit more right now. Really excited to have everyone here. We'll kick off. This is module 0. It's the first kernel fireside of block 4, and we're very, very grateful to have Vitalik Buterin with us today to help us kick off well. We have a bit of an intro to kernel that we'll do, which is typical of the kernel fireside, just to set the stage for our guest and also to kick us into meaningful conversation. So the asks of everyone in Slack is just to be engaged, to be active. If you have something that comes to mind, put it in chat. My role is mostly going to be in chat, hanging out with you all. Alicia and Andy will be with Vitalik, meandering through conversation. And we'll do 40 minutes of conversation with Vitalik and then 25 minutes of Q&A with Kernel Fellows, where people can unmute, ask questions, or we can ask from the Slido. But last time we had a lot of fun kind of going quick fire, and Vitalik got through many questions in 20-ish minutes. So our hope is we can recreate that type of adventure. The Kernel Fellows are what make that all possible. With all of your backgrounds and distinctions, this room is just chock full of people who are doing interesting things in Web3 or are very likely to start doing interesting things in Web3 very soon. Vitalik already kind of has heard about this, so I'll keep it brief, but the intention for today is to get past all of these titles and to just enjoy the space together. So please be aware, be around, and help us to make the most of the hour. The 8 weeks starts now. This week, we've kind of started to get into the kernel book. We've started to get into Junto's, you know about your adventure, and we're working towards that. This conversation starts to bring us beyond that, into the types of conversations that we hope to have in kernel. The couple of questions we started with is, at an individual level, how might we build a better web for ourselves? One that we enjoy being a part of, one that we enjoy participating in, and at the same time, can we do that in a way that honors our own gifts and who we really are? That's one way to talk about kernel. But I'll pass it to Andy to talk about some of the other things that we've put in the syllabus and to start talking about Module 0 to kick us off.
Thank you very much. I know everybody is really, really excited, and my request for the next hour and a half is to not stay in that excitement. Breathe, find yourself where you are, feel yourself in your environment, be relaxed, check in with your body, be aware, intentional, and bring real questions from the heart that come from a genuine desire to know rather than a desire to seem other than what you are. This is really what Kernel is about, which is serving with humility, right? This is software as service, not as a service, just service. And of course, the question arises then, who are we really serving? And it's ourselves first. We serve ourselves because we are each other's environment. Just as that is true on this call, it's also true in the wider network of which we're a part. And the goal of Kernel, as is stated on the website, is to serve the continued creation of free money. And we can go into that another time when Vitalik is not among us, but think very deeply about this notion of free money and what it really means in terms of wealth. One of the things which got me most interested in Bitcoin and decentralized networks many years ago was this notion that we could redefine wealth. And of course, the question that arises as a result of that is redefine it to what? And the only sustainable kind of wealth that I have been able to find in the years since then has been the realization that who you are and what you are right now is enough. The sense of genuine contentment without a reason is wealth beyond measure. So in thinking about that, we have put together the syllabus in a way which teaches both technical skills, knowledge, and understanding in combination with more reflective, meditative, introspective content aimed primarily at self-knowledge. This notion of individual and technology operating in concert in order to form genuinely creative, collaborative, and constructive networks is not a new one, but it is something that is given additional context by the implementation of truly decentralized networks, not just in the architectural sense, but also perhaps even in the logical one. Another old article of Vitalik's which you can read yourselves is The Meaning of Decentralization. Wonderful piece. So from the play of pattern, we have this notion of complementary opposites, which we spoke about yesterday in Yunso's, that everything in the world of time and space arises as one of two. And the goal of all of our thinking in Kernel is not just to hold these opposites in mind without falling into contradiction, but to go beyond that and to see the unified spectrum on which both opposites exist and to choose with humility the kinds of trade-offs that we want to make without expecting or imposing on others those same trade-offs, recognizing that everybody is free to make their own choices. And that is grounded in the very practical example of trust, because we can build trustless protocols by defining clearly and precisely in a verifiable manner and in executable language what it means to cheat. So for instance, you can't double spend coins, right? The classic example of what it means to cheat on these kinds of networks. Another fancier way of putting this notion of trust and what it means to cheat is the notion of collusion resistance, right? And Vitalik, you've recently written a response to Nathan Schneider on the idea of crypto economics, its benefits, potential applications, and also its limitations, in which you argue that finance is, it arises in systems that do not actively try to prevent collusion. And, you know, when we build mechanisms that do prevent collusion, we can create uses for these networks which are not purely financial. And in building purposeful mechanisms, we can secure more value-centric governance. And this is where we want to start, this notion of value-centric governance, because Ethereum seems to sort of be the best example that we currently have of that, with the principle of subtraction and Kaizen. So our first question for you is, you know, what values most appeal to you? And where do you look for these kinds of values in your life?
I think when we're talking about like what values you want a protocol to have, like one thing to keep in mind, right, is like to what extent like can you even like put in your values, and to what extent is the protocol supposed to kind of reflect the values of its community. I think when you're starting up a new community, like I do think that like you have a choice, right? And like I would even say that someone creating a new community has a responsibility to kind of be very kind of upfront and specific about like what their own values are. Just because if you do that, then like you actually get a community of people who are like know what they're getting into, and the people that come in are the kinds of people that share the same values as you, right? Like if you don't do that, then you just get much more easily get this mass of people that are difficult to align along any axis except basically making more money, and that's where a lot of projects end up failing, right? And Ethereum itself, definitely, I think did do that, right? Like from the very beginning, we were very clear about like the goal of Ethereum as being this like open platform for innovation that you know, instead of it being us saying like here are some specific things that we want done with a blockchain and we're going to build a blockchain around them, it's like no, it's an open platform, and what gets built on it ultimately depends on the community and the participants' own creativity. Also much more of an emphasis on kind of actually getting the benefits of cooperation and collaboration. So like this is like one of those aspects of Ethereum that I think is to some extent a reaction to kind of earlier crypto culture, where like I sometimes criticize it for like what I call mountain manism, right? Like this idea where you have these ecosystems that just completely build around the assumption that the users are individuals that can literally not trust anyone at all other than themselves. And like in reality, mountain manism is philosophically like completely incoherent, right? Because like at the very least, like none of the even self-proclaimed adherents of that mindset are going to personally go and verify, like say the Bitcoin client, right? So you know they're happy to rely on like what I call a one of n trust model. You know there's at least one person that's auditing that would find some bugs, but like if you look at some of the earliest approaches to say wallet security, you know, designing around one private key and telling people, hey, you know, you have to try really, really hard to make sure the key never gets lost and never gets stolen. And here's our 17 item guide on, you know, how you're supposed to try really hard to make sure that absolutely never happens. And like the kinds of approaches that I feel like we've been emphasizing, just even like building for and even talking about since the beginning, have more to do with like, you know, hey, there's a crowd of people, and like decentralization comes because, well, the benefit is that, you know, you have the resistance against like any small portion of that crowd turning out to be not who you think they are, or turning out to be less honest than you expect. But like ultimately, like, you know, you can trust the majority of people to be honest most of the time, and that's an assumption that we can kind of actually leverage and get benefits from, right? So that's and also just in the selection of kind of applications that we focused on at the beginning, right? Like DAOs is probably one big example. Even just like crypto-based UBIs, like actually focusing on the kind of egalitarian aspects of blockchains and thinking like, can we make blockchain-based kind of gadgets or like contraptions or whatever you call them that actually are more egalitarian in different ways. So I think there's lots of ways in which in like Ethereum's early history, like there were choices about like things that we talked about, things that were that we spent more energy trying to kind of build out and theorize out early on. And that ended up, I think, like really reflecting the kinds of a community that exists today. Now, I think today, obviously the ability of kind of any kind of Ethereum elite to like really manipulate the culture in some direction and even like manipulate the values that the platform kind of embodies in some direction is much more limited, which is like totally fine and good, right? Like it's ultimately a decentralized project, and like it ultimately is like the things that come out are a combination of the values of the people in the community together with the structure of the ecosystem, right? So like this kind of interaction between values and like you could say structure, or you could even say values and technology. This is another thing that I think is important to talk about. Vinay Gupta actually had an excellent thread on this a few months ago, right, where Vinay basically said, like, you know, hey, like the Ethereum community seems to have these kind of political values. I think Vinay called it something like very strange. He called it radicalized Canadian politics, which I thought was kind of fun. But then he said, like, okay, you know, so you have this community, and like in theory they believe in this thing that like Vinay calls radicalized Canadian politics. But then like what is the technology? The technology is smart contracts. What is a smart contract? It's a kind of cold, unfeeling automaton, and if it's the sort of thing where if you make even the tiniest mistake when you interact with it, it's gonna like grab $60 million from you and it's gonna tell you SFYL, right? So that's sorry for your loss. It's a sarcastic crypto internet way of making fun of people who lost money, which is not a very polite thing to do. But you know, since when is our internet randos polite? So like this is I thought a very deep and important point, and it's one that the Ethereum ecosystem should think about more, right? Because basically like when you like to some extent there is a mismatch between kind of professed values and what the technology actually does. One even more salient example of this, right, is that like egalitarianism and just like accessibility are big professed values for a lot of people in the community. But at the same time, like if you look at transaction fees, like, you know, it costs like $5 or $10 to send a transaction, right? And that's like beyond or way out of reach for, like, say, the average person in Nigeria. So that's like one of those examples where like I think, you know, there is this kind of divide between what the values are and what the thing does. And ultimately, if what the thing doesn't change to reflect what the values are, then what the values are going to change whether we like it or not to fit around what the thing does. And like that would be at least in my opinion, a very unfortunate thing, right? And like there are some signs of that happening already. Like I saw there were a couple of like these tweets. I think this was back when kind of like the big Solana spike was happening, and people were making comments saying things like, you know, oh, like so you know, Solana is like Walmart, and Ethereum is like Louis Vuitton or something like that. And like when I looked at that, like my own personal reaction is like, you know, I don't know. I personally am like, I'm much more pro Walmart than I am pro Louis Vuitton, right? Like one is just like you know, basically a negative sum status signaling game for rich people, and the other one, like, you know, okay, you can maybe complain about how they treat employees, but like at least they give like the common people affordable stuff, right? And that's like a really lovely and virtuous thing to do. So when like, you know, you start getting Twitter influencers kind of feeling like they have to defend Ethereum by saying that like, hey, it's the toy for rich people, and being the toy for rich people is like the cool and serious thing to be, then, you know, they're like, it's a problem. It's like, you know, like no, we're not going to change our values and like start like acting like you know, serving rich people is more meaningful than serving everyone else. Like, no, we have to improve the technology, right? And like the good news is that the technology is improving, right? The like layer twos have just seen massive success over the last month or so. Like Optimism and Arbitrum, they've gone up to something like $100,000 of transaction fees a day. I think layer twos as a whole are doing something like, I forget, like I remember there was one day they did 5 transactions a second over an entire day. So layer 2s are already like really significantly increasing the capacity of the Ethereum ecosystem, right? Optimism is doing really well. Arbitrum is doing really well. Polygon acquired Hermes for like $250 billion, right? So Polygon is a side chain today, but they're looking very well set up to be a ZK rollup in the future. So layer 2 scaling is happening, and if you go to l2fees.info, like the transaction fees on layer 2 protocols are way cheaper than they are on layer 1. So yes, there is a way to make Ethereum can be affordable for the masses, and like that stuff is actually happening, and that's something that we should be cheering, right? So like the kind of like the fees and egalitarianism question is one example of that kind of like trait tension where of what happens when values and capability misalign. But then the other example of values and capability misaligning is this kind of finance versus public goods question, right? That I want to get back to because I think it's like probably the big topic for today. So in that case, like basically the problem is right that once again like Ethereum people I think are more likely to like take public goods seriously and understands that public goods are a real problem or a real thing that like needs to properly be cared for in a healthy ecosystem, and that like if we just focus on things that have business models, then that's going to lead to like very lopsided and unbalanced ecosystems. But at the same time, if you just look at like blockchains, the technology are an infrastructure that's like really designed, or at least by default, it's designed around financialization, right? Like you can tokenize things, and then you can make wrapper contracts for things. Even if someone makes something that's non-transferable, you can stick it into a wrapper contract, and then you can like transfer ownership of the wrapper contracts. Like so. Then you can take out DeFi loans on things, and if you take DeFi loans on things, then as I wrote in one of my recent posts, like that's also an obfuscated way of like separating out governance power from economic interest, and then you can just sell the governance power to the highest bidder. The reason why financialization is such a big problem, right, is basically because like it's basic, like what financialization is at the core, right, is optimized and structured collusion. And what I mean by that, I think to explain what I mean by this, I can give an example, right? So this is the example in the post, right? Like if you think about like 2 different point systems that I think are very important to all of our lives. One of those point systems is money. The other of those point systems is likes on Twitter, right? Both of these are point systems, right? Like they're points. You want to have more. There's extrinsic value in having more, right? Like if you get more retweets, then more people see your tweet. And if you get more money, you can use the money to buy stuff. But then at the same time, both money and Twitter likes and retweets also start to kind of acquire this sort of symbolic social status value. They acquire this gamification value, and so people try to acquire these things for those reasons as well. So like they're both point systems that have a lot of properties in common. Also high inequality in both cases, right? But what's the big difference between the two? And the big difference between the two is basically that in the case of Twitter likes, there isn't an efficient market that for I like your tweet if you like my tweet. Whereas with money, like there is an efficient market for I give you $100 if you give me 140 Singapore dollars, right? That's just called foreign exchange. So in the case of money, like I give you X in exchange for you giving me Y is a feature. In exchange, in the case of Twitter likes and retweets, I like you in exchange for you liking me is a bug. And like in any case where there's if someone tries to set up some kind of like institutionalized gadget for making that market easier, like that's the sort of thing that Twitter was going to clamp down on, right? And even the extent to which markets for, like, say, between Twitter likes and money exist today, right? Like there are markets where you can go and like purchase likes and retweets and accounts. Like that's the sort of thing that Twitter also considers a bug, and they actively try to go after and prevent that stuff. Now, what would happen if Twitter let itself financialize, right? What would happen if Twitter stopped trying to prevent kind of I like you in exchange for you liking me markets? Basically, like, first of all, what would happen is in the current design, Twitter would just hyperinflate, right? Because basically everyone is going to give you at least an epsilon bribe, like at least a very tiny bribe in exchange for you liking their tweet. And so the result is that everyone is just going to like everything, right? So that's hyperinflation. Now, let's say Twitter changes their design and it says, okay, we're going to fight hyperinflation. We're going to say everyone can only issue 100 likes every day. And let's say if you issue more than 100 likes, then your likes kind of start decreasing in value, right? So let's say if you issue 200, if you like 200 tweets in a day, then every one of those likes will be worth half a point instead of being worth 1 point, right? So you have 100 likes, and you can fractionize them, but at the end of the day, it adds up to 100. Now what happens? Well, now basically what we've actually done is you've just literally turned likes into money, right? You've basically turned Twitter into Twitter with a tip jar, right? Basically, what's going to happen is that there are going to be people who really wants to purchase likes, and there's going to be like poor people that want to use that are using Twitter, and they don't value like the ability to make likes that highly, but what they do value is like, hey, this particular person is in India, and if you get like $4 more, then like they can make sure that their family gets like gets significantly better healthcare, or they can like eat significantly better food for an entire couple of weeks, right? And so they're just gonna like basically go and take their 100 Twitter likes and just convert them to rupees, right? So basically, like, if Twitter let itself allow more collusion, if Twitter let itself allow kind of I like you in exchange for you like me, or I retweet you in exchange for you give me some other thing outside the system markets, then Twitter's going to look like money, right? So financialization is collusion, and basically what's going to happen is so financialization is the same thing as collusion. And if you actually like understand the economics of collusion, one of the things that you realize is that like there's this branch of economics called cooperative game theory that basically tries to kind of do game theory without one of the spherical cow assumptions, game theory without the individual choice assumption. And in game theory with the individual choice assumption, there's this concept of a Nash equilibrium, right? Like you can always find a Nash equilibrium, and you can structure games around any particular Nash equilibrium that you want. But in the case of a cooperative game theory where you don't have the luxury of individual choice, then what happens is that there is no stable equilibrium, right? And like if you let the game run, it'll just kind of keep on bouncing around between a whole bunch of different unstable states forever, right? So basically, like, financialization is collusion, and collusion ultimately leads to instability. And so if you want to have governance that has stability, we need to augment blockchains and kind of blockchain and crypto-economic like approaches with other styles of approaches for solving for kind of solving these governance problems.
There's so much there. The first thing I want to say is that count me in as a radically optimistic Canadian any day. Yeah, thank you very much. The thing that I want to kind of focus in on is where you've ended there, which is that like there needs to be some other kind of center around which we can organize these hybrid financial systems in order to get the best of both worlds, where we can be explicit about the kinds of financial mechanisms that we use in order to prevent certain kinds of collusion, but also embed these within other kinds of more civil society or like political based systems, which allow for different kinds of dynamic defense. This is to relate it back to the first question we asked you, what values are you interested in? One of the things that humans suck at is, cool, we can define what values I'm interested in, but how do I exist in a system where there are multiple different applications with many different kinds of value-centric governance? In that post, one of the really interesting things that you say is that as opposed to nation states who have this kind of incentive either to extraterritorialize themselves and impose their will upon everybody in the world, or to enclose themselves and close down their borders. So you have this will to domination or this will to enclosure. The governance that gets implemented in any given application on a blockchain doesn't affect the shared, it doesn't have control over the shared substrate on which it exists. And so like, how do we think about, I wonder if we lost him, I hope not. How do we think about these systems in which we can have like multiple different kinds of value-centric governance interfacing usefully and collaborating with one another?
Yes. So one of the really important things that I talked about, right, is this concept of, and Nathan talked about as well, this concept of having kind of financialized systems that are kind of built around some kind of non-financialized backstop. And the reason why this is a good idea is that it's much easier to make a stable financialized mechanism if it is kind of sitting on top of this mechanism of last resort that has incentives that are created in some other way, right? Like one example of this is just like any of these Oracle or governance or like whatever you want to call it, like that entire general category of things, right? The problem basically is that if you make everything, even including the bottom layer, financialized, then there's this risk of 51% attacks, right? And the 51% attack, if it's powerful enough, can even 51% attack the bottom layer. And then you have this problem that I think I've called it a people as epsilon attack before. Basically, the problem is that even if you have an attacker like either pre-commit to with enough power to voting for the wrong outcome, or just like bribe enough people to vote for the wrong outcome, and that bribe is really tiny, then like once they make that attack credible, and once they kind of flip the equilibrium to the point where it's in people expect that the attack is going to succeed, and so whatever incentives normally would guide toward truth seeking end up instead kind of flipping over and guiding toward helping the attacker do the attack. Then the attacker can often just do their attack either at a very low cost or even very profitably, right? But these kinds of attacks, they all depend on this idea that like everything, even including the bottom layer, is like subjects to or a part of this kind of financialized governance, and so you can do all of these vote bribing and all of these other financial attacks, right? But if instead you have a bottom layer that you can trust for other reasons, right? So like, for example, imagine a selection, like a vote between 200 people. And those 200 people were like selected ahead of time for being a diverse group of people and that are each individually considered to be fairly trustworthy. And let's say this is an arrangement that you consider to be reasonably safe, right? Then what's going to happen is that, you know, basically you're not going to have these people's epsilon attacks because everyone at every layer of the financial part of the system knows that ultimately there is this ability to appeal to the non-financial layer, and if the non-financial layer is almost certainly going to make the kind of correct decision, then the incentives are in the direction of kind of agreeing with what the non-financial system will ultimately do, right? And if in that kind of a situation, basically, like the incentive, like sure, you know, the attacker can bribe, but you have these kind of very strong incentive gradients, and like the incentive gradient itself cannot be attacked, right? Because the incentive gradient itself is ultimately protected by this non-financial system. And you basically have this kind of guaranteed property of what I call individual accountability, which means that if you, as a participant, even in the financial layer, make an action which is like ultimately is kind of accepted as being a correct action, that or at least contributes to an outcome that is later determined to be good, then you as an individual get rewarded. And if you as an individual contribute to some action that gets later determined to be harmful, then you as an individual suffer, right? And making this the accountability individual rather than collective, like that turns out to be really key in like making sure that kind of the math lines up and you don't have this tragedy of the commons, where like each individual doesn't actually have a big incentive to resist attacks because, well, they only and like they're an insignificant portion, kind of share of the results, and the incentives or the individual incentives, are not in their favor, or even are just in favor of the attacker. So basically, if you have like, and there's a couple of different examples of these kinds of backstops, right? Like one example that the big example is prediction markets, right? Like in a prediction market, the financialized component is the market itself, right? And the financialization basically creates a profit incentive for all sorts of people from outside of the ecosystem to come in and kind of express their opinions in the form of bets. But then ultimately there's a backstop, which is the reporting mechanism, right? And the reporting mechanism actually is how the outcomes get fed into the system. And so if you make a prediction, then later on, if the outcome, where the outcome is provided by this oracle, which is governed in some different way, agrees with your prediction, you get rewarded. But then if you make a prediction and it turns out to be incorrect, then you get penalized, right? And so prediction markets are really powerful because they have individual accountability, but then individual accountability against what outcome, right? And in order for that's the system to actually be able to get those outcomes in a way where the outcome getting mechanism itself can't be attacked, like you can't have that final outcome getting layer, it's like be financialized either, right? And so that like basically you need to have something else. Now, what is that something else? It could be non-coin driven voting. By far the simplest thing is, of course, forking, right? Like, and this is what Augur and Kleros do or say already. Like basically, if someone 51% attacks Augur, then someone can just spin up a new instance of Augur, and that new instance of Augur would only have the coins of would only give coin balances to people who voted honestly in the original. And basically, if you then have 2 copies of Augur, 1 copy of Augur, basically the coins are only held by dishonest people, and that's the copy that got 51% attacked. And then there's this new fork copy, and in that new fork copy, coins are only held by honest people. Well, we know which one is more useful and which one is gonna have a higher market cap, right? But the problem with these kinds of techniques is that they're limited, because the amount of value that can be at stake in such a system is limited by the market cap of the rep token, right? Like you're not going to be able to have a system where the assets at stake are like 50 times greater than the market cap of the rep token. And traditional finance can do that, right? Like the assets under management of the big banks are like much greater than the bank's market cap. But if these financialized DeFi projects tried to do that, then someone would have an incentive to just go and buy up half the tokens and actually just do the attack. And like, sure, someone's going to fork and they're going to lose their tokens, but for like basically every one of those questions that was actually being bet by the prediction market, like they could like basically trick the system into thinking they win and grab all the money, right? So actually, like limiting financialization can even increase the assets under management that things like prediction markets, stable coins, synthetic assets, like all these kinds of contraptions can handle safely. I feel like I've talked enough.
Amazing. Yeah, it's really interesting that the points about doing mechanism design that focuses on accountability rather than the individual choice that one finds in spherical cow economics leads to the maths aligning better. And it's something worth considering if you're designing any mechanisms for anyone on the call. I want to just take us back a little bit further into some of the more interesting sort of social aspects, perhaps, that you had mentioned in your first answer. 2 things kind of stand out for me, right? The one is that in another post about these kinds of coordination problems and games in cooperative game theory, these majority games that have no core, no stable outcome or Nash equilibrium. You know, one of the points that you make in this post is that we ought to be measuring intention rather than action. And it links to what you said. It's such an interesting little soundbite from earlier that's, you know, most people are honest. And knowing this, we can leverage this to our advantage in the systems that we design. Often people are asking, hey, how can we incentivize more honest behavior? But like if we begin with the assumption that people are generally speaking quite honest, can we build systems which leverage that rather than like getting stuck in questions of incentivization and honesty? So how do we measure intention in the sense of what you're talking about in that post? And what was your intention when beginning Ethereum, and how has that grown and shifted in the years since?
Sure. So I guess like first I can explain in more detail this like kind of intention and action divide, and why like looking at intention is like really important and unavoidable. So like let's take the example of vote buying in an election, right? Like there is an election, and let's take the perspective of one particular voter in the election, and let's say this voter votes for the orange candidate, right? So the voter votes for the orange candidate, and there's two possible reasons why the voter might have voted for the orange candidate. One of those reasons is that the voter thinks that the orange candidate is actually a good candidate. And the second reason is that the voter got bribed, right? And like the voting for the orange candidate because you think that the orange candidate is a good candidate, like that is an okay action to take, right? But voting for the orange candidate because you got bribed is not an okay action to take. But the problem is that it's the same action in both cases, and whether or not you acted in a way that's okay actually depends clearly not on the action itself, but it depends on like ultimately what was your thought process when you came to that action. And the reason why it has to be this way is because, like, if you look at it from the point of view of a mechanism designer, right? The mechanism designer is always kind of lives behind this Rawlsian veil, right? Like, they don't know, like, ahead of time, what the correct outcomes are going to be, right? Like, you might think that the orange candidate is bad, but the mechanism designer does not know that the orange candidate is bad. The mechanism designer does not even know ahead of time that there will be an orange candidate. Maybe they thought it'll be red versus yellow. Maybe they thought it'll be like, green versus like rainbow and unicorn. So ultimately, if you just like kind of do the economic math, a voting system where people vote according to their true feelings gives results that are like not perfect, but at least reasonably good. But a voting system where people just sell their votes to the highest bidder just is one where an arbitrarily bad candidate can win because they can just bribe enough individual voters, and because each individual voter only absorbs a very small portion of the benefit or cost of their particular vote. Like basically, they're going to, if they act kind of like selfishly and rationally, they're going to be really cheap to bribe, and like it just becomes very cheap to buy the election, right? So it just like you have this paradox where, like, on the one hand, like, in both cases, the guy voted for the orange guy. Like, how can voting for the orange guy have worse consequences if you do it for as a result of your personal feelings about the orange guy versus because he got bribed? Like, it's the same action. The same action has the same consequences. But on the other hand, like, if you kind of step back and look at it from behind the veil, like, you just know that, like, and like if you just analyze the mechanism, you know that in a system where people vote for candidates because of their personal feelings is an okay one, and a system where people just sell their voting power to the highest bidder is one that very easily leads to like all sorts of attacks and ruin, right? And so this is like why you do need to like look at intentions and not just action. And it's also very closely related to why you need to actually, like, why we need to do all of this stuff around like trying to kind of police and prevent collusion, right? Like, because like if you could kind of filter the good from the bad by just looking at actions, then, like, the blockchain could do that, the smart contract could do that. But if that, like, it's unavoidable and you have to actually kind of filter out intentions, then you have to start looking at, like, well, what kind of technology can we, what kind of techniques can we use to make it more difficult for people to kind of collude with each other in these undesirable ways, right? So that's the intention versus action divide. So trying to kind of put this into the context of cryptocurrencies, right? I mean, people in the cryptocurrency space, right? I mean, like, they do lots of things. One of the things that they do is they yell on Twitter about how awesome their favorite coin is, right? Which is, like, a totally natural and healthy thing to do. But if you, like, there's a difference between, saying that some particular coin is awesome because you actually believe it's awesome, versus saying that a particular coin is awesome because you hold a lot of that coin and you want it to go up, versus saying that you really love a coin because like you literally got paid to say that by the developers of the coin. So like these kinds of things like exist, and they're kind of a problem everywhere, right? So I guess like intentions in the in the Ethereum ecosystem. I mean, I feel like a lot of different participants in the ecosystem had a lot of different intentions, right? Like there's I think like the values of the very early participants, and I think closer to the beginning of the chat, like I talked about what some of those values are. There is obviously a lot of people participate in the ecosystem because it's their job and they can get coins that way, and like I think that's totally fine. I think one of the kind of traps to avoid, right, is actually kind of being like binary about incentives and saying, either you're doing it out of the kindness of your heart or you're a money grabber. I think like in reality, when you're talking about real human beings, like it's it's never one extreme and it's never the other extreme. It's always a combination of the two, right? Like on the one hand, I think if you give almost anyone the choice between earning $100,000 a year doing something that's or like really aligns with their values, versus earning $100,001 a year doing something that like they personally think makes the world worse, like almost everyone's going to take the first option, right? Like the $100,000 a year with value alignment. But then on the other hand, if you give someone a choice between, say, earning like $25,000 off of a couple of Ethereum Foundation grants, working on a purely open source public good project that's kind of very clean and pristine, does not even have its own token, that's just for the good of the Ethereum ecosystem, versus earning $100 million working on an ICO, like lots of people, even if they really have those values, are just going to like give up and work on the ICO. Like even if they start off taking the first option, like just seeing the pressure of all of their friends who sold out a little more easily than they did, like enjoying their parties and private jets in the Caribbean while they're still earning $25,000 a year, like that really grinds against people, right? Like that's really demotivating, and like you're definitely going to get more people taking the $100 million ICO route. So I think like values other than kind of money maximization and altruistic values exist, but you also cannot rely on them infinitely, right? And this also ties into this kind of values and technology tension that I talked about, right? Like in that, the Ethereum ecosystem like kind of heavily values public goods. Ethereum heavily values open source, and open source anything is a public good. So of course, the Ethereum ecosystem highly values public goods, but the Ethereum ecosystem at the same time, like it's up until recently did not have very good public goods funding infrastructure, and so there was this tension. And I think now we have a lot of these projects that are working really hard to fortunately resolve that tension in the direction of actually having infrastructure for funding public goods that's really robust.
Yeah, I wonder, just digging into public goods a little bit. I feel like it's always helpful to keep getting definitions or what your lens, and many people's lenses, but like what your lens of a public good is, because I think that part of the problem in terms of funding, I mean, digital open source software is more straightforward, but in terms of the wider ecosystem, how do you view a public good?
Good question. So my simple definition of a public good is it's a project that benefits a large and unselective group of people. So a project that provides a benefit to a lot of people, but where you as the person doing that project do not have a fine-grained choice. Like you do not have the ability to say this particular group of people can benefit, this other particular group of people cannot benefit. Like either it benefits everyone or it doesn't get produced at all. So like one example of something which is large scale but is selective is like, let's say Starbucks coffees, right? Like Starbucks, produces coffees and it gives those coffees out to millions of people. But Starbucks coffees are not a public good because Starbucks has the ability to make these very fine-grained choices and say, you get your coffee, you don't get your coffee, you get your coffee, you get your coffee, and you don't get your coffee. And so Starbucks has this option at their disposal, which is like, hey, we're going to charge $3 or $4 for the coffee. And if you can pony up the $3 or $4, you get your coffee, and you can't, then you don't. But if, on the other hand, you have someone producing an actual public good, like let's say someone like publishing freely available online education videos, right? Like they don't have that choice, right? Like they don't have the ability to say like, you can access it, you can't. Now, obviously they could instead make videos that are like not freely available, right? Like, so they could create a club good instead of a public good. And that's an option that exists sometimes, but not always. Like, for example, if you just invent ideas, for example, like, right, like, and even just like simple algorithms, like that's the sort of thing where, like, in order to make that useful for anyone, like you just have to spread it and make it available to people, right? Even like, and then at the same, like in the case of the cryptocurrency space, where like if your software is not open source, people are not going to trust it, right? So like you have no choice but to make the software open source. And if the software is open source, then like once one person can download it, they can re-upload it, and so everyone can download it. So like basically public goods, the important property that they have is that despite being really valuable for lots and lots of people, they do not have a good business model, like within the context of trade and property rights. And so we need to have like some kind of other ways of funding them. Now, what those public goods are can be really diverse, right? So just some random examples. Scientific research is a public good. Cleaning carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is a public good. This conversation, if it gets published in a freely accessible medium, would be a public good. My blog is a public good. The Ethereum client is a public good. A country providing national defense is a public good, right? Like it's impractical to kind of provide defense to some houses but not to their neighbors, because like, hey, like what's the enemy gonna do? Are they just gonna like drop a nuke, and like that nuke is just gonna like be really polite and only hit some of the it only hit the houses that didn't pay the bills? Like, no, it's not how it works, right? So like it just is a property of the world that there are a lot of these really important things where like you just like the only way to do them is to do them for everyone, and we need to have more and better ways of providing these things.
Yeah, and I wonder just in terms of, incentives not being binary, I wonder when you think about defining public goods, do you visualize it in terms of more of a spectrum or a matrix? Like, how do you think about this trade-off between like the value provided to a certain level of public and the like level of extraction or market failure?
Good, sure, great question. There's a lot of things that are on the spectrum between private and publicness. So one example might be, say, healthcare, right? Like healthcare is kind of, in the simplest analysis, it's a private good. It's totally possible for you to give healthcare to some people but not to other people. But then it turns out that at the same time, like there are a lot of these kind of positive spillover effects, right? Like one is that if someone is healthier, then they can be a better contributor to society. There's also just people's altruistic preferences, right? Like everyone kind of altruistically wants everyone, including people that don't have the ability to pay for their own doctors, to be healthy. And like people's kind of preferences in this regard, like lots of people feel this way and kind of that adds up, right? And so that also becomes a public good. Health insurance is like a public good to a limited extent because of adverse selection issues. So like there's a lot of these really subtle examples where, you do have kind of a private good and the public good components that are kind of mixed inside of the same thing. And like that happens all the time. Education is a good example. Education is kind of in the most direct analysis of private good, but at the same time, unless of course it's like you're educating through providing these kind of online materials that are free for everyone. But even one-on-one tutoring, right? Like it's a private good, but at the same time, there's a public good component because that person that you're educating is going to be a better contributor to society. They're going to, provide higher quality inputs to political mechanisms, and so your local government is going to be better. They're going to be more likely to produce public goods of other kinds. So lots of things have positive spillovers. Sometimes like you could even have like negative spillovers as well. Like there's things that contribute to systemic risks. So within the crypto space, like you have a lot of things that are private goods, but that contribute to centralization risk. And so like one thing that an ecosystem that funds public goods might want to do is it might want to subsidize alternatives, subsidize kind of institutions that provide those private goods, but in a way that has fewer systemic risk downsides, right? So subsidize things that provide public goods, but where the kind of the public good component of the project is still kind of like much better than the available alternatives. So final answer, yes, like things that are partially private and partially public exist all the time, and that's really, really important.
Yeah, and I wonder, just going back to talking about science as a very obvious public good and scientific research, we have a question from Alexandra. How do we design a community that incentivizes good science? If governance is too wide too soon, there is a chance small groups will have unwanted influence.
And Vitalik, before you get into that, one thing I wanted to add, we have Kai Krutler on the call from Gnosis Guild, and she wrote this post on the prehistory of DAOs, which I think is required reading. She's going to be helping us through a guild to study DAOs more closely. And she adds a quote that I think is really related here to the whole conversation. From her piece, it says, "Far from the best answer to the social media woes of Web 2.0, tokenization introduces more financialized relations." This is something we've been talking about a lot. As a guiding star, Web3 applications could aim to introduce value in relations which have historically denied it, such as labor and environment, rather than creating new financialized relations. And I think, Vitalik, as you expand on science specifically, it would be interesting to hear your thought on this, where financialization could be added in a more healthy way.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So in general, I think like the value of financialization, first of all, right, is that like it just brings in like this big incentive for these kind of like very powerful and professional actors to participate. So one like example I could zero in on, which is I think relevant to what you have in mind, and also really relevant to science as well, is retroactive public goods funding, right? Like this is this idea that you have a gadget that funds public goods after the fact. So it funds public goods after they have already shown to have provided value to the ecosystem. And then if those projects need money in order, like before the facts to be built, then like those projects can go get investors, right? Either they can get a private investor, or those projects can issue project tokens, and those project tokens would get bought up by investors, and that would give a pool of money for the projects to pay expenses. And then the retroactive public goods funding gadget would also end up like giving those investors a payout, right? Like either it would just give a direct payout. So, you invested $100,000 into a project that ended up being a really, really important public good. Well, the retroactive public goods funding DAO could just give you a $6 million payout. Or if you bought into a project token, then the retroactive public goods funding DAO could buy up the project tokens. So the idea there basically is that you have this kind of non-financial and probably democratic mechanism for determining after the fact what things were ended up being good, but then to convert that into before the fact a kind of proactive incentives, like what you have investment, right, which is basically like a type of prediction market, which is very financialized. And the reason why I think like adding that financialization could be good is because like if it's like one of the challenges with public goods funding is like there's this category of public goods that I call entrepreneurial public goods, right? Like these are public goods where they are goods and they are public goods, but at the same time, like they have this character that they're not like you're never going to get a social consensus that the thing is worth doing until the thing is already done and everyone has seen the value, right? Like until that happens, the best that you can possibly get is like a small group of people being way ahead of the curve and realizing that this is something valuable. And the like democratic mechanisms are not good at like making non-conformist decisions, right? And so not democratic mechanisms are not going to be good at like making those kinds of entrepreneurial decisions. And like we even see this in politics, for example, right? Like if you remember, like about 10 years ago, there was the whole Solyndra debacle, right? Like where the U.S. government's like, okay, they made a bad investment, they stuck $500 million into a bad solar power company, and that went bankrupt. And then like you have this one failure, and everyone just kind of like went completely berserk about it, and are like, see, this is why you're not supposed to make investments of this type, and just stop doing these kinds of things completely. And like that's like from a VC mindset, like that's just like such an incredibly horrible reaction to have, right? Because like basically what you're saying is that okay, you have one failure, and because of one failure, you're just gonna like dismiss this entire category. But like no, the way VC works is like 90% of things are failures, and the whole thing is made up for by the remaining 10%, right? So, but then at the same time, like different groups of people have different levels of sophistication and quality in actually finding that 10%. And be like actually identifying which public goods will be valuable in the future, like that's not like the sort of thing that's necessarily best done democratically. Like that's the sort of thing that often maybe actually is best done by like specific individuals that with kind of intention and foresight. But if you are going to entrust specific individuals with intention and foresight, then they have to be accountable, right? And retroactive public goods funding provides accountability. If they invest in things that turn out to be good, then that turn out to have a real impact, then they get even more money and they can make even more investments in the future. And if they invest in things that turn out to be total junk, well, then they over time they're going to have less and less money, and eventually they're going to drop out. So that's retroactive public goods funding. Like I think. Like we proposed it in the context of things in the Ethereum ecosystem, but it's the sort of thing that I think could absolutely be done for kind of scientific research and kind of early stage science in general as well.
Yeah, I wonder also in terms of retroactive public goods funding being an effective model for compensating, projects that go on to make a huge contribution in the community. How do you think about how we compensate those individuals and projects in the first instance in terms of funding? Because that, kind of what Gitcoin grants is aimed at doing, being able to go from 0 to 1. So if we've got it sorted when they get to 10, how do we get from 0 to 1 more effectively? And I also wonder, just kind of as part of this question as well, is it possible to think about funding projects in this space more in terms of funding individuals versus funding, traditionally in Tech 2 and Web 2, it would be called like a company or a startup. But as we've kind of experienced, there are so many ripple effects and so many positive flow-ons from one individual taking an action or being in a space. So how can we think about that kind of shift in terms of what we value? Like you don't have to be in a startup to be deemed valuable, because we know that VCs are investing, in founders, really not the startup. So how can we bring that model in to public goods in this ecosystem?
Sure. So I think public goods funding, like both retroactive and regular, it absolutely does not need to just go to companies, right? Like it can also go to individuals. And I think there have been good examples of this happening, right? Like Austin Griffith, I think would be a good example of an individual that's successfully gotten a lot of funding through Gitcoin. So it can happen already. And also another thing that I think can happen is you can have funding, whether regular Gitcoin grant style or retroactive, going to unstructured teams, right? Like one example of this is the EIP 1559 NFT, right? Like this was this NFT that was sold when EIP 1559 launched successfully. And the proceeds from that EIP ended up getting distributed across a fairly wide selection. Like basically it was kind of like a cap table of these like people that kind of who made significant contributions to making that EIP happen, right? There was no legal entity. There was like no formal anything. Like all there was just like this table, right? And that's like that kind of model of kind of like a very loose coupling. Like I think that's something that the Ethereum ecosystem is increasingly good at already, and I think that's definitely something that should, like, the funding structures should definitely do a good, as good a job as they can of actually adapting around that reality. Another example of this, if you take the account abstraction proposal that I released or published on Twitter yesterday, right? Like that was work between, there was myself, there were at least two people from the OpenGSN team. There were at least 3 people from the Netherminds team. And like there might have been other people as well, right? So like basically you just have these kind of ad hoc flash teams coming in from all just, you know, very cross-organizational, you know, whatever people's kind of broader identities are, like within the context of the Ethereum community, like, you know, in this moment, like they are part of the this account abstraction group, and they just kind of come together in a Telegram chat, and everyone does their thing to make it happen. Sometimes you even have different groups of people coming in to make it happen without any explicit collaboration, right? Like these informal teams, like they don't even necessarily need to have bosses. Like often, you know, you just have people that are working on different pieces, and you know, if there is a big disagreement, then like either they, like everyone kind of comes to consensus and resolves it productively, or the team just like splits in half, and instead of having one project, you have 2 projects. And like sometimes they might compete, and sometimes it might, you know, you might even get like a kind of, you know, a really good outcome coming out of the split, which is that you end up getting 2 separate things that are both valuable. So having public goods funding structures that are good at kind of adapting to that reality is definitely something that's really important. And I think it's something that like our existing public goods funding infrastructure is already pretty well suited to adapt to. So I think we just have to kind of, you know, keep doing more of what we've been doing already.
Yeah, I think that makes sense in terms of the structure being there, and it almost feels like there just needs to be more of that culture or social dark matter kind of being enforced around really implementing it. And so just on that idea, I wonder, we've had, I think, a question, I don't have a name for this, but it says historically collectively held beliefs or stories have enabled wide-scale collaboration and community among humans. What do you think the role of storytelling is in Web3?
And one quick thing, Vitalik, for you, there are probably like 40 questions here. We could probably start doing quick fire. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I definitely do want to get to sleep soon. It's past midnight here, so yeah. Okay. I mean, I'll answer this one, and then I'll just like go through the chat by rapid fire. I think, what's the role of stories? I think like stories and kind of narratives and ideologies and all these kinds of things in general play a really important role in motivating people, right? Like when we talk about, you know, people not being motivated not just by money, but also by like some conception of like wanting to be good and like wanting to be part of like some kind of something greater. Well, you know, what is that good? Like what is that something greater? Like how people define that is itself a like a product of you know, the narratives and stories that we have, and it's a result of all of these kind of public discussions that end up happening. So kind of yes, you know, like clearly articulating visions and like visions of how all of the different pieces of things that people could be working on fit together into something that makes sense and into something that's really important for the world is definitely something really important. Okay, rapid fire on the, I guess, questions. So should I be looking just at the chat here?
Oh, there is a link to, hold on one second.
Yeah, where's the link?
what's on the screen here is probably a like curated list. We're just trying to get some quick ones, but we can go quick. This first
Sure.
one.
I see it. The app Slido blah 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 questions, right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
it.
Okay. Loading. Okay. How do we design a community that incentivizes good science? I feel like I've covered that. Thoughts
Yeah,
on
you
the
got that
limited
one.
utility of tokens as abstractions of commodities? I think, ooh, interesting. I mean, you could definitely have tokens that represent many kinds of commodities. Like you can have wrapped tokens. I think one of the, there's two limitations. One limitation is that if you want to make a token that represents something that is external to the system, then you need to have trust. And the other limitation is that precisely because of the collusion issues that I talked about, some things that like don't really fit well into the abstraction of being a commodity, like governance power, for example. And so we don't necessarily want it to be a token. Do I have thoughts on the potential of Web3 to decentralize the power of AI from big tech? Interesting. I think the potential of Web3 is basically that you can have kind of more layer separation. Like centralized tech tends to like really deeply bake the AI into being part of the platform, whereas Web3 is more like, you have this open source core that implements fairly simple logic, and then AIs kind of exist on the outside, and AIs, instead of being the platform, AIs are just participants in the platform. And I think like actually trying out that model is a really important thing that the space could be doing. Would I like to be a mentor for? Unfortunately, don't know enough about the program. What yet to be invented Web3 use case will convince my grandma to get involved? I think like my view on Web3 killer apps is that it's not a killer app, it's a killer ecosystem, right? Like we have money, and money is is a thing that grandmas use all the time, right? Even high-tech money, like things like WeChat Pay get used by grandmas all the time. Then you have things like ENS and all the identity infrastructure. Identity infrastructure is like things that lay people use all the time. Games, everyone plays games. Virtual assets of different kinds, right? Like there's plenty of Web3 things that like lay people can absolutely completely get involved in. And actually, even like things like CryptoKitties, like people have already have, right? So I think it's just a matter of the entire ecosystem continuing to grow and become more useful to the point where it gets to critical mass. How to make DAOs more effective? I think like two things. One, experiment with more or less financialized governance, and two, just reduce transaction fees and generally make blockchains more accessible. Let's see. So, what's the role of anonymity for blockchains? I think like anonymity is really important in a lot of cases. Anonymity is even really important in governance, for example, right? Like secret ballots. If you vote, nobody knows how you in particular voted, and you can't even prove how you voted if you want to. Like that's a case where kind of very strong privacy and strong anonymity is a necessary security feature for the system to not completely collapse to attacks. So I think there's lots of places in which strong privacy in blockchain applications is really important. Vitalik, can I say wag me? Wag me, I said it. Okay.
I want to make sure you get to bed soon. So there's one question that has shot up on the list. It's now near the top. It's a very simple question, and maybe one to take a quick deep breath because you've been so gracious with us. You've answered so many questions. It's very simple. How are you doing? How are you feeling? How do you feel on all things at this point?
Good. Again, I think lots of fun things happening in Ethereum land. I'm really excited to see the space kind of actually go from just being ideas and being theory into just all suddenly being these things that exist in practice all of a sudden. I'm really excited just to see what it's going to end up looking like in 5 years' time.
Amazing. You've been so generous with us. Thank you so much for being here. We hope you get a great night's rest. You've given us at least a couple of days of material to go back through. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for organizing.
Cool. Okay, well, I know Vitalik is probably going to go to bed. We'll have a bit of time to debrief collectively. We have the after party in Cafe Kernel, which has been a very fun spot to hang these days. There's a limit on the number of seats we have in there. So hop in if you can. I'll put the link in the chat so that you have it. If you can't make it, we totally get it. Let me make sure this is the right link. Yeah, thank you for the send-off question, Ben. And thank you everyone for being here. I mean, over 200 people, great questions. The quick fire really made my day. So I'm really happy. And thank you to Andy and Alicia, as always, for your help. Amazing. Uh-oh. Okay, so we got to get going into gather. Looks like it might cut us off at 40 for the next 5 minutes, but we'll put the link in Slack as well so that you can join us in there as soon as possible. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Everyone, great
I
talk.
want to say, big thank you to Alicia, Vivek, and Andy for moderating that talk. Really
Thanks,
good
man.
questions. Our stewards did a really good job bringing in like the paragon of who I'd want to talk to for the first time. So thank you so much. Love you guys. I'll see you at the thing. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Vivek, did we manage to save the chat? Is that possible? I don't know how to do that.
It is. I'll click save now, and anyone else can.
Oh, okay.
Great. Can you guys share that on the Slack?
Yeah. We will. Good to see you all.
Yeah, nice to see you, man. All right, I'll see you in the gather town.
Peace.